I was pleasantly surprised to find out that William Lane Craig, um, in a recent debate, in his opening remarks defending the existence of God, appealed to the ontological argument. And the reason why that's surprising is that William Lane Craig has done a lot of debates over the years, and the uh, his opening speech never includes the ontological argument. So this is the first time that he has used that argument. And I myself would view the ontological argument for God's existence to be probably the best argument for the existence of God, because it doesn't appeal to sensory experience. The senses are, I presume, generally reliable. However, if you see something, you could always make the claim. You have the back door of escape to say, well, perhaps I was hallucinating or something, some sort of optical illusion, or so on. But if you can have an argument that appeals only to reason alone, then there's no way to escape the conclusion that God exists. So that's what the ontological argument is claiming to do. And uh, Alvin Plantinga, a philosopher who is still alive, he has developed the argument. He and Norman Malcolm, who I don't think is alive, but he may be, and Charles Hartshorne and others have developed this argument from Anselm's Proslogion, um, and have used a system of modal logic, namely S5, to um, further develop it, to update it, um, and use the semantics of possible worlds. So the idea, uh, the argument, and this isn't how Craig expressed it in the debate, but how you could express it to kind of shorten it up and make it more obvious as far as being able to understand what the argument is, um, the structure of the argument and the uh, logic behind it. To kind of simplify that, we could say premise one: if it's possible that God exists, then God does exist. Premise two: it is possible that God exists. And the conclusion number three: therefore God exists. So again, this is not how it was expressed in the debate, and it's not immediately obvious in this form that premise one is correct. There are lots of things, after all, that are possible, but not actual. Um, so, uh, but however, um, the really controversial premise in the argument is not premise one. Atheist philosophers are pretty much in agreement um, that is correct. So Christians, theists, atheists will agree, if it's possible for God to exist, then God does exist. Now that doesn't mean you can't find somebody somewhere who will deny that, and you have to be familiar with all the stuff I'm leaving out about the axioms of the system S5. Um, but uh, the logic itself behind that leads to that premise is, I think, unassailable. And as Craig says in the debate, the only philosopher that he's aware of that denies that premise one would be J. Howard Sobel. Um, so you can find people who will deny anything in philosophy, but the fact is that you find philosophers who deny the law of non-contradiction, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore it. It's still a law of logic. So um, the, the 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 premise one, as I've stated it, is merely just a kind of a summary of these axioms of S5. So S5 is something that all logicians would use um, and view as being a rational way to think about various sorts of problems in philosophy. So it's not immediately obvious that is so, that premise one is unassailable, but it nevertheless is a good um, premise to hold to, and one that even atheistic philosophers are not going to deny. But premise two is a bit more controversial, that it's possible for God to exist. Um, but it really seems to me that you would have a hard time showing that is a self-contradictory idea, the idea of God. Um, and I'm actually trying to, in my own mind, work out some of the details of uh, making that more than just a gut feeling, um, to show that yes, God is possible. Um, Whether he exists or not is another story, but it's possible that he exists. With the modal ontological argument, if it's even possible that God exists, then God does exist. Now, who is it that admits that it's possible for God to exist? They're not committed to belief in God, but they're not atheists either. Well, this would be what has classically been called agnostics. So agnosticism allows for the possibility, in some sense, of the existence of God. So if the possibility that they're talking about is the same as the possibility that premise 1 and 2 are talking about, and in some forms of agnosticism that would be um, perhaps um, they would perhaps be used univocally in the two cases. Um, then we could say that agnosticism is an irrational position to hold. So if we go back to premise 1, premise 1 says if it's possible that God exists, then God does exist. The agnostic will allow that. It is possible that God exists. So the agnostic should admit um, that God exists. Now that should be nuanced a little bit, because the possibility that Gnostics are talking about, in some cases, I think, is it's possible because they don't know that it's false. So that's different from logical possibility in the modal sense. So I am aware of that fact, but if you don't see the concept of God as self-contradictory, um, which perhaps many agnostics don't take that step and say yes, it is definitely inconsistent, then if they allow for it to be possible or not self-inconsistent, the idea of God, then they should admit that the ontological argument, or at least premise 1 of the ontological argument, um, is something that should be persuasive to them, that God does in fact exist. So those sorts of agnostics are holding to an irrational position, if there are any such persons. Well, I just found that interesting, that there's kind of a feeling that philosophy and arguments of this sort never really go anywhere, but we're getting now to where if somebody will allow for even the possibility of God's existing, they admit that he will exist. And that's why premise 2 is more controversial, because people don't want to allow for that, or people will say that they don't allow for that possibility. That they'll say that God is impossible. So God either can't exist or he definitely does exist. There's no middle ground.